employed at Eli Lilly and is currently on the board at the Bach Institute for Research on Aging and University of Michigan, and has many other accolades, which we won't get into, but I'm sure he will have great perspective. Matt Vincent is in the middle. He joined Advanced Cell Technology in 2011 as a Director of Corporate Development, having worked as outside IP counsel and then as a business development consultant with the company since 2005. So you'll bring a lot of great insights as well based on that and your other experience of 21 years. So we're counting on getting some great perspective from you. He's done patent litigation, but is also wearing another hat, has done strategic partnering and collaborations, a master, one might say, maybe, at regulatory affairs, or at least dabbled. It's on here. Dabbled, okay. And has also done some clinical trial management. And then finally, we have Brock Reeve. He's the Executive Director of Harvard Stem Cell Institute. Brock has, yep, that's badly written here. This is my editing. I apologize for that.
Well, we can skip it then.
In partnership with the facility directors at the Harvard Stem Cell Institute, he has overall responsibility for the operations and strategy of the Institute. The Institute is comprised of the schools of the Harvard University and all of its affiliated hospitals and research institutes. So I can imagine that's a lot to juggle with many divergent viewpoints as you're trying to engage in strategic partnerships. So we'd love to hear even how you manage that. And so with no further ado, I just want you to know that I want to keep this very informal, small group. If you have questions, just raise your hand. Don't shout them out, though. And we'll take questions as we go along. It's just very conversational. This is a wealth of experience right here from which I think you will garner some really great insights. I'm counting on that from our terrific panelists. But I think what we should do, maybe start off by just each of you giving maybe 2-minute summaries of some of your perspectives on deals and what you have done. So Brock, I'm sure that a lot of people don't know about Evotech or the GSK deal. Maybe talk a little bit about that, and each of you talk about some highlights in deal making, and to start this off.
Thanks, Lona. So as Lona mentioned, the Stem Cell Institute at Harvard is a slightly odd animal because we're not a standalone nonprofit institution, so we don't have legal status. We're part of Harvard, even though we cut across Harvard and all the Harvard-affiliated hospitals, each of which are independent legal entities. So everyone owns their own IP. So that leads to some of the complexity Alona was talking about. Nonetheless, one of the reasons the Institute was formed was a way of sort of harnessing those resources, taking a stem cell slice across that network, and with the notion of not only conducting basic research, but also ultimately curing disease. And we're going after all the major disease categories one would want to think about. And as a result, our mission is not just to write Science and Nature and Cell papers, but also to get things into the clinic and into the market. And that's where the partnering gets important for us. We can talk about specific examples when we come back to it. Alona mentioned two, which are sort of quite different. And one of those was a partnership with GSK that we struck about over 5 years ago now, and in fact we're renewing it. It was set up as a 5-year deal, and one of the $5 million a year over that time period, with half a dozen projects across several different institutions. So it was really coordinated and driven through the Institute as a way of getting PIs in multiple institutions working on joint projects with GSK in several different disease areas: cardiovascular disease, muscle, cancer, and others. And as I said, we're doing that. So that was a project or a relationship that sort of the Institute led on behalf of all these different institutions. And so we had to get every institution to agree to the same terms, which took a while. But one of the reasons we're able to do that is because we ourselves are a funder within the Harvard network, and so we ourselves have a standing agreement. We ourselves had to get everyone on the same term in terms of projects that we're funding and driving. So we could sort of point to that and say, okay, now we can do it with an outside party. And that was really driven by a desire for GSK to sort of use stem cells to think about drug discovery in a very different way. So the goal isn't to look for cell therapy. The goal is to say, how do we use stem cells to both understand disease and accelerate drug discovery and ultimately find new medicines? And we can talk about that later. The Evotec example that Alona also mentioned is a very different one. And that was, we have a series of agreements with them over the last couple of years. One in diabetes, then one in kidney disease, one in motor neuron disease, and then a second one in diabetes. So we have 4 with different investigators in different institutions, including Harvard, Harvard, the Brigham, and actually, no, I say that, 2 institutions. I take that back. And what was interesting is that was really driven not by a corporate strategic perspective, but by investigator-to-investigator relationship, where some RPIs had close relationship with some of their key scientific people, said, look, we trust each other on the science, and each one of those projects was organized very differently. So some are joint resources and money doesn't trade hands. In other cases, the money does trade hands, and so they're all structured differently. And it's interesting is because Evotec, which from some perspective sort of is a CRO, is saying, look, how do we have partnerships with academic scientists and then help move the science, from our perspective, move the science far enough along to a point where a pharma company can get interested. So the diabetes one was the one we did first, and with a new hormone we had discovered. And a year after Evotec did the deal with us, they brought in the Janssen division of J&J. And that is something that we sort of couldn't have done on our own on day one and needed to move the science along further. And so there's an interesting 3-way relationship right now because of that. So maybe I'll stop there, but just give you a sense of sort of 2 very different types of two very different types of structure, 2 very different type of relationships, and driven by very different motivations.
Right, and Matt, I don't know if you, I don't think the ACT has a strategic partnership yet, but you must be thinking about them, so maybe tell us a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to kind of take us along to where we are today, because I think we're right at that the tipping point of, I think, feeling like we've accumulated enough experience with our product and data from our clinical trials to know that those conversations are close at hand. I think one of the interesting things right now in this industry in cell therapy is we've gotten to a place, I think, where a lot of big companies, whether it's global biotech or big pharma companies, see the risk profile as being acceptable. It's really a matter of being able to check the rest of the boxes in the kind of the diligence table that they would follow. And along the way, we've had a lot of discussions. Maybe I should just back up a step and say we have 3 ongoing clinical trials right now using cell therapies for treating different forms of macular degeneration, and we're about to start a 4th. So we have 3 indications covered: dry AMD, which is overall just kind of an accumulation of damage in the back of your eye as a consequence to aging; a genetic form of macular degeneration called Stargardt's disease; and the latest one, myopic macular dystrophy, is a structural defect in the eye that ultimately produces degeneration of the macula and vision loss. We use a cell therapy that we can inject into that space, ultimately to recapitulate and reform the structure in the back of the eye. And the hope is ultimately be able to stave off the progression of disease, and eventually get to very early stage patients where we can halt the disease altogether. So we're 34 patients into our trials now, but have been having ongoing discussions with most of the big pharma companies in the world for the last couple of years. And well, the degree of detail is changing. It's there's always been, these conversations always start with the science, really having to put a sharp focus on what it is for a problem that we want to solve and how we see our solution ultimately working out both in terms of a clinical trial program, but also generally how we thought about pricing and reimbursement and all the other commercial aspects that companies need to think about when they start considering those investments. As we're getting to the point now where, again, as I said, we've accumulated the experience and the data coming out of the clinical trials where these conversations have started to kind of pick up in pace and intensity, we started to recognize we need to put more time into a target product profile. And I think that's, for a lot of companies, something that you really can't begin early enough. It may change over time, but it will give you the ability to focus on some of the most critical questions that are going to get asked you in the course of diligence, right? It's going to help to serve as the foundation for what your clinical trials will look like, the type of endpoints, both primary and secondary, that you can imagine. It will bring into focus how you intend to address manufacturing and other CMC type issues. And it ultimately also helps to define what the pricing and reimbursement strategy would be, understanding whether you'll fall under existing CPT and HCPCS codes, or whether the process is going to require working even more closely with the private payers and CMS. And so that's, for us, that's part of what has occupied a lot of our time over the last 6 months to a year, is really beginning to move that package along so that is really ready for the types of discussions we hope to have in the relatively near future.
Can everybody hear in the back? Or do you want us to, everyone, I hear, yes? Okay, good. All right, so we won't use the mic. Well, as you can see, we already have two diverse experiences. Edward will have a lot to say because they've got some very big deals with pharma recently. And since we funded one of those projects, we're very happy to hear that at CIRM. Let's hear your experience with at least the 2 pharma deals. Give them a little background on what you're doing.
Sure. I will try. My voice is a bit...
okay, you might need the mic. Oh, boy. Laryngitis.
So I'm going to start what is obvious and try and be specific. So for us, and I think for every company that's trying to move products forward, partnering is part of an overall strategy. And as a public company, any company that's taking equity from investors, there's a balance in trying to build value and still return a return on that investment. Fortunately, in our industry, the alignment is nearly perfect of value creation to ultimate patient benefit. And so there's an alignment of those issues. So the question that we've asked all along is, how do we think about partnering in the context of building shareholder value and accelerating products to patients? And there are 2 basic issues in terms of building that value. One is, and both of them relate to dilution, whether it's equity dilution or technology dilution. We all have taken money from investors, that's equity dilution. But the real substance of what we are and what we're building is the technology value in our companies, the intellectual property value. And you think about building that value through both forward integration and development of our own assets, as well as accelerating that and monetizing some of that earlier on with partnerships. And so that's what we've tried to do, is look at the areas where we really do want to forward integrate, where we want to build value as a company, and then look for opportunities, usually at the front end of some of those product opportunities, where we can partner, but yet retain very significant value of our own, and build upon the investment of a partner for our own products after that. And so I'm happy to go into the specifics of it, but very generally, we have a 2-year-old partnership with Shire in the area of protein replacements. They have rights in the hemophilia area, but the exact same strategy is applicable to any protein replacement. So we've retained all the other products, particularly in the lysosomal storage diseases. And the front end of that is being funded by Shire. We get to retain and use all that value for our own applications. So that was our plan in that area. Similarly, in the stem cell area, we announced a partnership recently with Biogen in the area of hemoglobinopathy, so sickle cell and beta thal. And this is the program that was initially funded, ongoing funding from CIRM, But behind that, all of the process development, all of the modifications, all of the development activities that we're using in the beta thal and sickle cell program are directly applicable to any of the programs that we bring forward in CD34 modified cells. And there are numerous ones that we're looking to take forward ourselves. So it's partnering is a function of our strategy. It's a function of creating shareholder value. It's a function of accelerating products to patients. And I'm happy to give specifics on that.
And I'm happy to hear you mention that out-licensing is dilution, because that's something that people are not used to thinking about. But this is the second time I've heard somebody mention that. It was a different conference, and the first time someone mentioned it at the other conference, people in the audience like, oh, yeah, I guess it really is. It's a form of dilution because you're losing, a lot of revenue from that. And isn't the Shire deal, they have an option to, what, 5 to 7? Seven
targets.
Okay. So when's too much? I mean, I bet that you're probably maybe hearing from other pharmas that want access now to maybe, some other therapeutic areas. And what do? How do you create sort of the equation as to when you're going to draw the line, without delving too much into your confidential information, but...
I didn't put up my forward-looking statement slide. It's a great question, and it is dilution. On the other hand, dilution is a requirement. You have to take money to invest in science. You have to move things forward, and it's just the question of at what point in your evolution as a company, what sort of dilution do you take? The more successful you are, the more you wish you'd retained. And so we've been lucky in taking advantage of some of these maybe current but past markets, and we've raised almost $200 million in the last 9 months. And that's put us in a very different position to think about forward integration, to think about adding value to our products versus the interest in partnering. But go back 3 years ago, look at where our market cap was, look at our cash position, look at what the market receptivity was, and I'd do that deal all over again. Would I do the same deal today? No. But companies have different needs at different times, and success, you do different things. Failure, you do other things. And it's just a question of what makes sense at the time.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions. Would you do it again, the Shire deal?
At the time, absolutely.
Well, yes. I mean, with the facts that you had at hand, it was a great deal.
There's the whole other issue as a public company, maybe as a private company, but certainly as a public company, of the perception of external validation, particularly in emerging technologies like ours, right? If somebody who's putatively smart writes you a check, that's this external validation, and that was a big part of the Shire deal for us, and then quite frankly on the CD34 side, the Biogen deal for us.
Mm-hmm. I venture to say it was a good validation for our industry overall as well. I mean, every time we get one of these deals early on, I like to put those deals, you'll see I will do it tomorrow, front and center and say, look, pharma's coming. They see the value in this, and they are investing in very serious ways. So, Matt,
yes.
Knowing and hearing what we've just talked about, dilution, I mean, does that influence which of your different projects you think are appropriate for out-licensing to the extent you're comfortable identifying any of this?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the one thing to bear in mind is we're probably Sangamo and ACT are probably on kind of opposite ends of the spectrum in many regards, in that you have a platform technology that can be applied across a lot of different areas, where application in one area doesn't necessarily create a competitive problem licensing it to somebody else. And that's a wonderful platform to be in. I think if you look at the clinical program I've been talking about, the RP program, the issue there is it's beautiful in that it's the same cell, the same formulation of cell that can be used to treat 200 different indications. But it's difficult to imagine in any one geography trying to license multiple parties for different indications, right? Because now you worry about crossover sales and things like that. And so, that I think the dynamics of deciding when to partner a program like that are a little bit different. The way I look at it is it's that scale, right? Which it's hanging on to it as long as you can to build as much value as you can. It's the rough rule of thumb is around a multiple of 10 as you go from preclinical to approval of your IND and into phase 1, and then another multiple of 10 in terms of what you could potentially demand for, the whole overall deal structure, but certainly more of an upfront licensing fee, getting to the end of phase 1, having not only some safety data, but maybe some decent efficacy data or hints of efficacy data, and then again another multiple of 10 when you get to the end of phase 2, in part because the risk goes down. And I think that's where that's the way we approach this. We look at this and say, we're going to balance the value of it against the value of bringing a big pharma or biotech partner to the table that has much more experience and a lot more bandwidth to put behind all of what I would call the final mile problems that you need in a clinical program, right? It's one thing to conduct the clinical trials in 1 or 2 countries, but having somebody who understands the global regulatory strategy that needs to be carried out and able to coordinate it across multiple jurisdictions where you have the opportunity for a global pivotal study, for example, that can manage the manufacturing scale up with you and think about what your final product is going to look like in terms of final formulation in time that you have that ready for phase 3. That can help you managing the pricing and reimbursement discussions that, again, right now everyone says you need to be starting those with at least the major payers, as early as phase 1. And so, I think if you look at the likelihood of success for any given product, I mean, it's clear the likelihood of success is going to be a lot greater bringing in the resources of a big pharma company as early as you can. And for us, that's been the calculation of where's that balance.
But you have 2 other programs too, correct? So
we do.
So you're referring to your, what I call your,
Yeah.
getting back to my New
Right.
Jersey accent. Tried so hard to get rid of it. But would you not want to?
No, we would actually.Ed and I talked in the hall, and he said he's going to write me a big check for one of the
Yeah.
forward-looking statement, right? I'm just kidding. No, so we actually, even in the ophthalmology, we've got this whole regenerative ophthalmology program with other cell types coming behind it, and conversations we're already having with potential partners more in a collaborative setting. We have a mesenchymal stem cell program, which again has both good animal studies in kind of the classical animal models, but we've also opened up an INAD with the FDA, so we're treating companion pets now with Tufts Medical School and generating data there. And those are ones, and then there's the platelet program and the artificial blood. And those are ones I think we're very interested in trying to find partners earlier on. Again, it's putting the whole package together and again demonstrating what the differentiation is of our products versus the other. Those are spaces that are, mesenchymal stem cell space is crowded, and so I think you just need to have a really robust data package, which I think we're close to. But it's understanding who you're competing with and who are the potential partners out there. There's not a lot of big pharma companies in that space yet. I think they sit on the sidelines and they don't see what's happening. And you just have to recognize that as you approach your partnering as well.
And Brock, you come from a completely different perspective, but I wanted to pick up on your statement that you reviewed the GSK agreement for another, 5 years. So give us a little sense as to why your colleagues felt it was worthwhile to go in and what some of the lessons learned were from the first agreement that might have been incorporated into the second stage.
Yeah, actually, can I make one comment before we get that? Picking up on what Edward and Matt were saying, as we think, as we think about where the value is created, I think we also have to think about what are we good at doing. It's not only where you create and how you capture the value, but who contributes to that value, where else get those resources. And just to put my biases on the table is, what academic institutions aren't very good at, I think, is as you think about what's it take to bring an idea from concept all the way to the market, is really sort of thinking about where the value is in that. Typically we'll get involved in these conversations, say, but we had the big idea, the big breakthrough, and the typical pharma company said, but wait a minute, there's tons more work that has to happen before that ever meets the market, right? And they say, yeah, but you never would have gotten that if so you end up in those discussions, and you've all seen that. And what I haven't seen yet, except in rare instances, is where both companies and academics are sort of good at figuring that out together, if you see what I'm saying. Because typically the companies say, okay, do all this stuff and prove it to me because I know everything that can go wrong, right? And the academics say, but wait a minute, you wouldn't even get to that point if you didn't have sort of, the insight up front. And sort of figuring out that middle territory, I think, is an interesting challenge for all of us collectively. And as part of that, I think even where we have the resources. So, for example, a place like Harvard, one of the ideas of the Stem Cell Institute was that we go from basic research all the way to clinical trials under one umbrella without having to own all the assets. On the other hand, yeah, we have some chemistry, but we're not good at chemistry, right? So the people I think who are good at sort of understanding this are people like, say, someone like Lee Rubin, who runs our cell-based screening center, who worked in a company and has worked in academia, or someone like Mason Freeman at MGH, who worked at Novartis and works at MGH, who's seen sort of both the academic and the corporate side, and they're running drug discovery programs in academic settings now, but they know what it's like on the corporate side. They can say, okay, I know what it takes to actually move something along the pipeline and can help play a role in that middle. And as a result, to sort of get around to your question, they can have impact on, both the scientists in sort of both the academic or the corporate camp, say, and help sort of broker that conversation so that we understand sort of where we need, where each party needs the other one. And I think one of the things that we've learned over the last few years with this, GSK project is where we've been able to see things go from the academic lab into the corporate side. What's gotten taken up, what doesn't, what was an interesting question, but great science but irrelevant, or where were people sort of jointly excited about it. And there's not only the science part, but there's also the organizational and structural part in terms of, is there joint commitment? Is there joint interest? Is management changing? And a new person one of the things that happens on the corporate side, a new person comes in to run a program, says, I don't want to do that, in cancer, I want to do this. And we'll see sort of those changes. So it's a mixture of multiple factors in terms of what it takes to make that successful.
So can I ask you a question about what you talked about earlier, that different perception of value and so on? One thing that how would you respond to somebody saying, okay, you guys think it's worth X, it's worth X minus Y.
Yeah.
How about an option, right? We'll pay you some modest amount, cover your costs, cover the FTEs, but we want a 12-month option or an option to X milestone to de-risk it. So we're not going to pay you much, just your costs. But at that point, we'll pay you your number relative to value. So you've locked up the asset for a modest amount of money with the potential taking the risk of that value. Have you guys, has that been proposed? Do you guys propose that? Does that seem like a bridging strategy?
I think it totally is. I think you'll see different institutions are differentially responsive to that notion of sort of joint risk sharing. And if there is joint risk sharing, they want to see that it really is sort of joint, right? And if we're putting in resources, or you're putting in resources of the same amount, that sort of stuff.
You're funding costs.
But you're funding costs and then participating in the upside when and if that happens and how it happens. So I'm seeing more of that and people getting more flexible about that. One of the interesting things I think on the academic institution side, as they're getting pressured by federal funding and other sources, they're all
become more flexible.
Yes.
On the one hand, they're more interested in recovering their costs, but on the other hand, they also know they have to become more flexible. So there's a bit of a tension in that, in that model as well.
So,
but definitely.
But now, what about on the corporate side? How do you see? Somebody walks in and says, "Great stuff. You've got 2 years worth of work to do. I'll take an option. I'll cover your costs, but you're tied up."
Yeah, no, you're using a sponsored research agreement to basically fund the option. Yeah. I think that's a good idea. I think there's a lot of academic labs. We use a lot of sponsored research now to do the work that we already have in mind. So we haven't gone to somebody and said, "We like what you do, we'll sponsor it." But I think if you're giving it the value as if the work's been done, ultimately, then I would think that the licensing offices in the academic settings would look at that and say, you know, that's perfect. In other words,
I meant for you guys.
Well, for us.
But I get the evil eye from Elon. It's not my job.
I know, I didn't get the evil eye.
I was just curious about it.
No, but I mean, I have something to say because first of all, 2 years ago, when people were doing option agreements and I was on a panel, the VCs were saying, I'll never do an option agreement ever. But the Capricorn deal, which I'll talk about a little bit more tomorrow, was an option deal. And it's great. They got $12.5 million up front, but it's an option, $300, I think, and $20 million if the results are good and they exercise the option. What if they don't exercise the option? Does that mean that product, you know, is forever tainted? And that's what the VCs have and object to.
Yes.
But to be frank with you, as you know, the CERM BD hat on, I'm trying to get 90 programs partnered out. I agree with you. The value in having a partner, especially with the academics, help direct and shape the project so that it is more appealable, it has the data that they want, is a good thing. And if an option is what it takes, or sponsored research agreement, from my perspective, personally, I think that's great.
You know, let's just hypothetically say 90 programs, 100 programs, 50 programs. You could go to 10, 20, 50 pharma companies, big biotech companies, and put all those programs in place and say, you can have, if you'll spend on it, if you'll apply diligence, you can have them for free. Right? I can tell you not all those programs are going to get picked up.
Exactly.
Right?
Right.
And actually, if we want to be cynical about it, a small percentage are going to get picked up.
Right.
So it's we got to figure out how to A, lower the barriers, but yet recover value in the end, and B, you know, find people who actually want to develop these kinds of drugs.
Right.
I mean,
It's not easy.
I mean, we've even done, let alone an option covering funds, we've even done projects where if we had funding where we did a joint, where they said, we'll put in these resources, you put in these resources, no money changes hands, but then we jointly share in whatever the upside is.
And that's the Evotech deal.
There is other variations on that.
And that's the beauty of the Evo. So I think that's